Hello. In this video, I read out the Japanese folktales in English. I would be happy if you could press the channel subscription and thumbs up now. Let's begin. From here, in a faraway land, where swallows fly away when winter comes, there was a king. The king had 11 sons, all called Eliza. All 11 brothers were princes, and they wore stars on their chests and swords at their waists, and went to school. They wrote with diamond pens on gold notebooks, and recited what they read in their books. Everyone could see at once that these boys were princes. Their younger sister, Eliza, sat on a little mirrored stool, and looked at picture books that would cost half the price of the kingdom if she bought them. Alas, these children were very happy. But things are not always the same. Their father, who was king over all the kingdom, had married a wicked queen. It was clear from the first day that the queen did not love her children at all. All the palace had a big celebration. The children played guests, but they did not get to enjoy the many sweets and baked apples they usually did. Instead, they had to eat and play with sand in their bowls. The next week, the queen took her little sister, Eliza, to the country and left her with a peasant couple. She returned soon after and told the king all sorts of things about the princes that never happened. The king then paid no attention to them. "You can fly away to any world you like and feed yourself," said the wicked queen. "Turn into a big, voiceless bird and fly away." But, of course, the swans did not end up as bad as the queen had cursed them to be. They turned into 11 beautiful wild swans. With strange cries, the swans flew out of the palace window, across the garden, and across the forest. Then, just before dawn, the swans came to where their sister Eliza was sleeping in the peasant's room. They flew over the roofs, bending their long necks and flapping their wings. But no one heard them or saw them. The swans had no choice but to fly on and on. Higher and higher they flew, even into the clouds. Farther and farther they flew, even to the ends of the vast world. Eventually they entered a great black forest that stretched all the way to the seashore. Poor little Eliza was all alone in the peasant house, and had nothing else to play with, so she played with a green leaf. She made a hole in the leaf and looked in the sun through it. It was as if she was looking into her brother's clear, beautiful eyes. Whenever the warm sunshine hit her cheeks, she remembered all the kisses her brothers had given her. Today, like yesterday, passed by day after day. As the wind blew through the hedge around the house, it whispered softly to the rose, "Is there anything more beautiful than you?" But the rose shook her head and replied, "There's Eliza." Then on Sundays, our grandmother stood at the door to Eliza's room and read from the hymn book. As the wind turned the pages of the book, it asked the book, "Is there anything more devout than you?" The hymn book then replied, "There's Eliza." And so what the roses and the hymn book had said was true. When the girl turned 15, she was to return to the palace again. But when the queen saw how beautiful Eliza was, she became envious and hated her. She wanted to turn her back into a wild swan, just like her brothers. But since the king wanted to see the princess, she couldn't do that right away. Early in the morning, the queen went to take a bath. The bath was made of marble, with a soft bed and a fine carpet to wake her up. Then the queen caught 3 toads from somewhere, held them in her arms, and rubbed their cheeks. She said to the first toad, "When Eliza comes to take a bath, sit on her head, and she will become as stupid as you." Then she turned to the second toad and said, "Sit on her forehead, and she will have an ugly face like you, and even her father will not be able to tell you the difference between you and you." Then she whispered to the third toad, sit on her chest, and she will catch the bad blood from you, and she will suffer greatly. And with this, the queen put the 3 toads into the clean water, and the water immediately turned a thick green. So they called Eliza, had her take off her clothes, and had her enter the bath. When Eliza got in, 1 toad landed on her hair. The 2nd toad landed on her forehead. The 3rd toad landed on her chest. But Eliza didn't seem to notice. After a while, when Eliza got out of the bath, right after her, 3 red poppy flowers were floating on the water. If the toads hadn't been poisonous, and if the witch queen hadn't rubbed them on her cheeks, they would have turned into red roses. But even though they were poisonous, and even though she rubbed them on her cheeks, the toads turned into flowers because they had landed on the girl's head, forehead, and chest. The girl was too good-hearted and too innocent for the magic to have any effect on her. When the wicked queen saw this, she rubbed Eliza's body with walnut juice to stain her brown. Then she applied a foul-smelling oil to her face, and made her beautiful hair turn unkempt and disheveled. And there was no trace of the sweet Eliza left. So when her father saw the princess, he was utterly shocked. And he said that she was not his daughter. No one could tell her apart anymore. All he knew was the dog that lay in the backyard, and the swallows in the tree, but these were poor, helpless birds. Then, crying, poor Eliza thought of her brothers, all gone. She looked so pitiful that she slipped out of the castle. She walked all day, through fields and streams, until she came out into a large forest. She didn't know where she was going. She was just disappointed and exhausted, and wanted to know where her brothers had gone. She thought that her brothers had probably been cast out into some other world, just like her, and she hoped that somehow she could find them and meet them again. After a short time, it was already dark in the forest, and night fell. Not knowing the way, Eliza lay down on the soft moss and leaned her head against a tree stump while she recited her evening prayer. All around her was a still, peaceful atmosphere. Hundreds of fireflies flashed with their green light in and on the grass. She even lightly touched a branch, and the night-glowing insects fell like shooting stars. All night long, Eliza dreamed of her brothers. They were still children as they had always been, writing with diamond slates on gold notebooks and looking at fine picture books that cost half the kingdom. But what they were writing on the notebooks was not the usual lines and lines. It was about the good things they had done, and the things they had seen and remembered. Then, everything in the book came to life. The birds sang songs, and all kinds of people came out of the book to talk with Eliza and her brothers. But when she turned the page, the things that came out flew right back to where they were, so there was no commotion. When Eliza woke up, the sun had already risen high in the sky. But the high echoes spread the branches above her head, so she couldn't see it. Just the light flickered down from above like a strip of gold leaf, and she could smell the scent of young green grass. The birds landed close to her shoulders. She could also hear the sound of water rushing. There were many springs in the area, and they all flowed into a lake with clean sand at the bottom. The lake was surrounded by thick undergrowth, but in one place a large entrance had been made by a deer. Eliza slipped through it and went to the edge of the lake. The lake was so bright and clean, and when the wind wasn't blowing the undergrowth and tree branches, the shadows cast on it looked just like the pictures painted on the bottom of the lake. Each leaf was reflected there equally clearly, whether the sun was shining from above or in the shade. Eliza looked at her face in the water and was surprised. It was an ugly, earthy face. But when she wet her hands with water and rubbed her eyes and forehead, her pure white skin began to shine again. So she took off her clothes and waded into the clear water. There was never another king's daughter more beautiful than this one in the world. Then, after putting her clothes back on and braiding her long hair as before, she went to the gushing spring and poured water into her palms and drank it. Then, without any destination in mind, she wandered deeper into the forest. Eliza thought of her beloved brothers. She thought of God, who would never abandon her. Truly, God had made wild apple trees grow there to stave off her hunger. God told Eliza. He showed her a tree that had bent under the weight of the apples. So Eliza had a good afternoon and bought a prop for the bent apple branch. Then she went back into the darkest depths of the forest. It was so quiet that she could hear her own footsteps and the sound of the leaves crumbling under her feet. There was not a single bird to be seen. Not a single ray of sunlight filtered through the dark grove. The trunks of the tall trees were pressed together, and looking ahead, it seemed as if there were several hedges tied together. Oh, it was a loneliness she had never known before. Night had fallen completely dark. Not another firefly was shining in the grass. With lonely memories, Eliza lay down to sleep. Then, it seemed as if the branches of the trees parted above her head, and through them, she could see the kind eyes of God watching from above the sky. Then, from the corner of her head, or between her arms, she saw a cute angel peeking out. When morning came, she did not know whether it was really morning, or if she was dreaming. Eliza walked a few steps further, and then she met an old woman carrying a basket of berries. The old woman gave her 2 or 3 berries. Eliza asked the old woman if the 11 princes had gone through the forest on their horses. No, the old woman answered. But yesterday, I saw 11 swans, each with a gold crown on their head, swimming in the river nearby. So the old woman took Eliza and led her down a hill a little ways. At the bottom of the hill, a small river meandered. At the river's edge, the brookly trees were pushing their long, leafy branches together. In places where the leaves could not grow together naturally, the roots of the trees split out of the earth and hung over the water, entangled with the branches. Eliza said goodbye to the old woman and followed the river down to where the mouth of the river flowed into the wide sea. A great, beautiful sea appeared before the girl's eyes. But not a single sail was visible on its surface. Not even a single boat floated on it. How could she go any further? The princess looked at the countless pebbles lying on the beach. The water had worn them all down into a round shape. Everything around her, be it glass, scraps of iron, or stones, was being reshaped by the water, which was even softer than the princess's soft hands. The waves are never stopping, and even hard things will eventually become slippery. I will do the same, never stopping. Waves keep coming in beautifully, and I want you to teach me good things. I feel like one day, thanks to you, I will be able to take you to my brothers. On the washed-out seaweed, 11 white swan feathers remained. Eliza gathered them into a bouquet. Drops of water were hanging on the feathers. She couldn't tell if they were dewdrops or teardrops. The beach was very lonely. But the scenery of the ocean was never the same. It was constantly changing, so it didn't feel so lonely. In the space of a few hours, it underwent more changes than an inland sea surrounded by calm land would in a year. Soon, large black clouds appeared. The sea seemed to say, even I have a difficult look on my face. Soon, the wind began to blow, and the waves turned their white flanks upward. But then the clouds began to shine bright red, and the wind stopped dead, and the sea looked like rose petals. Then it turned blue and white again. But no matter how calm the sea was, there were always ripples swaying on the shore. The water in the sea gently swelled up like a sleeping child's chest. Just as the sun was about to set, Eliza saw 11 wild swans, each with a gold crown on its head, flying up the hill. One by one, they followed one after the other, so well behaved that it looked like they were just wearing a long white sash. Then Eliza went up the slope and hid quietly in the bushes. The swans came down close to her, flapping their big white wings. As soon as the sun sank into the sea, the swans' feathers fell off, and 11 noble princes, Eliza's brothers, stood there. Eliza couldn't help but let out a loud cry. The brothers had changed quite a bit, but they soon realized it must have been her. So they jumped into their arms and called out their names, one by one. When the princes saw the princess come out again, though she had already grown taller and more beautiful, they were filled with indescribable joy when they realized she was their younger sister. They all cried and laughed, and soon they learned from each other's stories just how horrible their new mother had been to all of them. "We brothers," said the eldest brother. "While the sun is in the sky, we all fly around as swans, but as soon as the sun sets, we turn back into human form. Therefore, we must be constantly on our guard, and make sure that we have found a place somewhere to rest our feet before the sun sets. If we don't, and carelessly fly toward the clouds, we will instantly turn into humans and sink to the bottom of the sea. We don't live here. Beyond the sea, there is a country just as beautiful as this one. But we must go there. The road is very long, and we have to cross the vast ocean. There is no island on the way to spend the night. There is just a small rock jutting out into the sea. But it seems that the rock is large enough for everyone to sit together. When the sea is rough, the waves come over us, but even so, we are so grateful for the rock. There, we spend the night in human form. If it weren't for this rock, we would never be able to return to our beloved hometown. After all, to get there, we have to skip 2 of the longest days of the year. Only once a year are we allowed to visit our homeland. And so we stay here for 11 days, flying over this great forest. From above this forest, we can see our father's palace where we were born, and the tower of the temple where our mother is buried. So everything around here, be it the bushes or the trees, is like our relatives. Here, the wild horses are like children to us. Just as we saw, they were running across the plains. Even the charcoal burners were singing the same songs that we used to dance to in the past. This is the country where we were born. We just couldn't help but be drawn here. And so, thanks to coming here, we finally found you, my lovely little sister. We can stay here for 2 more days. Then we must cross the sea again to the beautiful country over there. But that is not the country where we were born. But how can we take you there? We don't have a ship or a boat. How can I save my brothers and return them to their original selves and go up the mountain?" the little sister said. So the brothers talked all night, and only dozed off for a few hours. Eliza suddenly woke up to the sound of the swan's wings flapping above her head. Her siblings had been transformed again. Soon they all flew off in a big circle. However, one of them, the youngest brother, remained behind. The swan rested his head on his sister's lap. They stayed together like this for the whole day. In the evening the other brothers returned. When the sun went down, they all changed back into their normal forms. "Tomorrow we will fly away, and this time we will not be able to come back until a whole year has passed. But we cannot leave you here like this. Do you have the courage to come with us? We are strong enough to carry you through this forest with just one arm. If we join our wings together we can carry you across the sea." "Yes, please take me," said Eliza. So they spent the whole night weaving a net out of the bark of flexible willow trees and their strong legs. It was big and strong, and Eliza lay down on the net. Then the sun rose, and the brothers turned into swans and picked up the end of the net in their beaks. And so, with his adorable little sister still sleeping soundly on his back, he flew high above the clouds. The sunlight was shining on her face, so one of the swans flew over her head, making a shadow for her with its large wings. When Eliza woke up, she found that they had already traveled quite a distance. She felt as if she was dreaming. How strange it must have seemed to her to be carried so high up through the sky, over the sea. Nearby was a branch with delicious, juicy berries and a bunch of fragrant roots. These had been brought to her by her youngest brother. When the younger sister spotted her brother's swan, she smiled and laughed happily from below. It was her brother flying over her head, casting a shadow over her with his wings. The ship had already flown quite high, and the large ship she had first spotted below was now floating on the water like a white seagull. A large mass of cloud suddenly appeared behind it, and from any angle it was a real mountain. Eliza saw her own shadow and the shadows of the 11 swans reflected in the mass of cloud. Everyone was amazed at the sight of such a large bird that they had to look up at. They flew like shadows. It was the most beautiful shadow she had ever seen. But as the sun rose higher and higher, and the clouds were left far behind, the shadowy floating image disappeared. All day long, the swans continued to fly through the sky, howling like turnip arrows. But, since they were accompanied by a younger sister, they tended to lag behind, and could not fly as they usually did. Meanwhile, the weather became unpleasant, and dusk was drawing near. Eliza looked at the setting sun, and, unable to see the lonely rocks still standing in the sea, looked worried. It seemed to her that the swans were beginning to flap their wings more vigorously. Alas, it was because of Eliza that all the brothers could not fly as fast as they had wanted to. When the sun finally set, everyone would have to turn back into humans and fall into the waterfall and drown. At that moment, Eliza uttered a prayer from the bottom of her heart. But they still couldn't find the rock. The black clouds kept coming closer. Soon they grew into a huge, ominous, black mountain that looked like a rolling lump of lead. Lightning began to flash continuously. The sun was finally about to sink to the edge of the sea. Eliza's heart trembled. The swans were going straight down, as if falling upside down. Just when she thought it over, they suddenly rose up again. The sun was already half hidden under the water. But then, for the first time, she spotted a small rock right below her eyes. It was so big that she wondered if that was what a seal was, and it was peeking out just above the water. The sun was sinking rapidly. At last, it looked as tiny as a star, and Eliza's feet were firmly on the ground. The sun looked like the last spark of a piece of paper that had burned up, and then it suddenly went out. The brothers stood around Eliza, holding hands. But there was only so much space. The waves crashed against the rocks ceaselessly, and splashed on Eliza's head like spray. The sky was lit up with a constant red fire, and there was a constant rumble, and thunder continued to rumble. But when the siblings held hands tightly and sang hymns together, it comforted them and made them feel better. In the dim light of dawn, the air was clear and the wind was gentle. As soon as the sun rose, the swans took Eliza and flew off the island. The sea was still choppy. Soon they flew high into the air and looked down, and saw white bubbles on the ocean below, like millions of swans swimming on the water. When the sun rose higher and higher, Eliza saw before her a mountainous country, half floating in the sky. At the top of the mountain stood a shining white mass of ice, and in the middle of it stood a castle that seemed to be several miles high, surrounded by many glittering columns. Eliza asked if this was the country they were going to. The swans shook their heads, for what Eliza had seen was a castle made of clouds that were constantly changing, and no one could live there. As she gazed, the mountain, forest, and castle all crumbled, and in their place were magnificent temples, all 20 high towers and pointed windows. She thought she heard an organ playing from there, but she misheard the sound of the sea. Soon, when they reached the temple, it quickly became a fleet and sailed across the sea. But when they looked closely, they saw that it was just mist rolling over the sea. Flying like this, watching the mirages that constantly changed before their eyes, they finally found the real country they were aiming for. There, beautiful blue mountains towered, a lush cedar forest was, and there was a town and a castle. While the sun was still high in the sky, they found themselves on a rock in front of a large cave. There, soft green vines were entwined, beautifully like sewn hangings. "Come, I wonder what kind of dreams you will have here tonight," said the youngest brother, and showed them his younger sister's sleeping quarters. "I wish God would tell me in my dreams how I can save my brothers and give them back to their original selves," answered her sister. This thought constantly played in Eliza's mind. She prayed earnestly to God for help, and continued praying while she slept. Then she flew high into the sky, and it seemed to her that she had flown all the way to Shinkaru's cloud castle. Then a beautiful, shining fairy came out to greet her. The fairy looked just like the old woman who had given her berries in the forest and told her the story of the swan with a gold crown on its head. "Your brothers will return to their original forms," said the lady. "But do you have the courage and patience to do so? Indeed, water is softer than your delicate hands, and yet it changes the shape of the stones. But it does not feel the pain your fingers feel. It has no heart. It does not suffer the pain you must endure. So look, my friend. Look at the nettle I hold in my hand. There are many of these growing around the cave where you sleep. Only these and the nettles that grow in the temple cemetery are of any use to you now. They will sting your hands so much that they will blister, but you must bear with it and pluck them. Those nettles will sting your hands so much that they will blister. Tear off the laxa with your feet, and use it for linen, and you must weave 11 coats of mail with long sleeves. Then throw them at the 11 swans, and the spell will be broken. But remember, from the time you begin the work until it is finished, however long it may take, you must not speak a word. During that time, the first word that comes out of your mouth will soon pierce your brothers' hearts like a dagger. Their lives depend on your tongue. Keep this in mind and remember it well." And so the girl touched Eliza's hand with the nettle. It was as hot as a burning fire, and Eliza woke with a start. And it was already daytime, and it was blazingly bright outside. Right next to where she had been sleeping, she saw nettles just like the ones she had seen in her dream. Eliza knelt down and prayed to God to thank her. Then she left the cave and got to work. With her delicate hands, she groped among the nasty nettles. The grass was as hot as fire, and it stung her arms and wrists so badly that they were burned. But she was willing to endure the pain if it would save her brothers. Then, with her bare feet, she trampled down the nettles she had picked, and took green flax from them. When the sun went down, her brothers returned. They were all surprised to see their younger sister had died. She thought that this was also some kind of evil magic by their mother. But when the little brother looked at his little sister's hands and realized that they were doing it for him, he cried. As the little brother's tears fell, the pain was gone, and the burn marks on his hands disappeared. Elise worked hard into the night. She would not rest for a moment until she had rescued her brothers. The next day, while the swans flew off elsewhere, Elise was left alone. But time did not pass as quickly as it had lately. One piece of chain mail was already finished. They were about to put together the second piece. At that moment, the sound of a longhorn flute was heard from up in the mountains. Elisa became frightened. The sound of the flute came closer and closer. They could also hear the barking of hunting dogs. Terrified, Eliza ran into the cave, and tied up the nettles she had collected into a bundle and sat on it. Soon, a large dog jumped out of the bushes. Then two, then three, jumped out in succession, barking noisily. They ran back once, then ran out again. Soon after, all the warriors dressed for hunting lined up in front of the cave. The one who looked the most noble among them was the king of the country. The king came briskly toward Eliza. In his life, the king had never seen such a beautiful girl. "You are a lovely child. Why have you come here?" the king asked. Eliza shook her head. It would be a pain to keep quiet. Her brothers would not be saved, and she would lose her life. So Eliza hid her hands under her apron so the king would not see her injured hands. "Come with me," the king said. "You do not belong here. If you are as kind-hearted as your face is, I will dress you in velvet and silk and place a gold crown on your head. You will live in my magnificent castle and be the queen of my kingdom." With this, the king put Eliza on his horse. Eliza cried and wrung her hands. But the king only said, "I only wish for your happiness. One day you will thank me." So with Eliza on his back, the king rode off through the mountains. His warriors followed close behind. When the sun went down, the king's beautiful city came into view. Many temples and towers lined the ground. Soon the king returned with Eliza to his castle. In the tall marble hall a great fountain gushed forth. The walls and ceiling were decorated with stunning paintings. But Eliza did not notice any of it. She just cried and lamented. Then, at the mercy of the maids, she was dressed in the queen's clothes, had jewels in her hair, and silk gloves put on her burned fingers. When Eliza appeared, fully dressed, she was so dazzlingly beautiful that the officials of the palace bowed their heads with even more respect. So the king wanted to make Eliza his queen, but one of them, the chief priest of the kingdom, shook his head and whispered that the beautiful girl from the forest must be a witch who was blinding the king's eyes and leading him astray. But the king would not listen to her and ordered the magnificent music to begin immediately. He had the best food prepared, and had the most beautiful girls dance for her. Then Eliza was led through a fragrant garden into a splendid hall. But there was not a trace of a smile on her lips or in her eyes. Only tears of sorrow seemed to have grown old and hardened, and would never grow old again. Then the king opened the door of a small room nearby, which he had specially prepared for Eliza to rest. The room was decorated with costly green curtains, and was built just like the cave where Eliza had been. There was morning glory spun from nettles on the floor. Hanging from the ceiling were finished chain mail. One of the warriors had brought them here because he found them fascinating. "Now, you can dream of returning to your old home," said the king. "See, this is the work you have been working on. Now, it will be a pleasure to be surrounded by this beautiful and noble decor and to reminisce about the past." When Eliza saw this, which she had always been fond of, a smile rose to her lips, and the blood flushed her cheeks. As she thought of saving her brothers, she placed her lips on the king's hand. The king pulled Eliza to his chest. Then, the bells of all the temples were rung to announce the wedding celebration. The mute girl from the forest had thus become the queen of the country. Then the high priest whispered strange words to the king. But they did not penetrate the king's heart. The wedding ceremony went smoothly. The high priest himself had to place the golden crown on the queen's head. In a malicious and hateful heart, the high priest deliberately forced a small ring onto the queen's head that did not fit her head, so that her forehead hurt. But a heavier ring could not be removed from her heart. It was a heart that pitied her brothers. In comparison, she could not feel any pain in her body. Even a single word could have endangered her brothers' lives, so she kept her lips tightly closed and continued to mute. But her eyes were fond of the good and kind king, who would do anything for her. And with each passing day, Eliza began to cherish the king with all her heart. Oh, how wonderful it would be if she could speak it out loud, if only she could tell the king how sad she was. But for now, she must remain mute as long as she can. She must stay mute and get her work done. So at night she would sneak away from the king's side, go into the cavernous room, and weave each piece of chain mail. But when she got to the 7th piece, the thread gave out. Eliza knew that she could find nettles growing in the temple cemetery, but she had to go and gather them herself. Why go that far? Oh, the pain in my fingers is nothing compared to the pain in my heart, she thought. I must do it. If I do it, God will surely help me. With a trembling heart, as if she were up to some evil deed, Eliza slipped out quietly into the garden on a moonlit night, walked down a long, wavy road, and through several lonely alleys to the temple cemetery. There, she found a group of blood-sucking demons sitting on the largest gravestone. These nasty creatures had taken off their tattered clothes, as if they wanted to bathe. Then, with their bony fingers, they scrutinized the new grave. Then, like brats, they gathered around the corpse, torn off the flesh and ate it. Eliza had to pass right by them. The ogres glared at her with frightening eyes. But praying in her heart, Eliza gathered up some burning nettles and returned to the castle with them. Only one person was watching her. It was the high priest of Revelation. This priest was awake while the others were asleep. Having seen through the night, Eliza felt that her theory had been correct. Such things were not the role of a leader. The woman was definitely a witch. And that was why she had led the king and the people astray. At confession in the temple, the high priest told the king what he had seen and what he thought. As the high priest uttered those terrible curses, the statues of the ancient priests in the temple shook their heads. If they had spoken, they would have wanted to say, "No, Eliza is innocent." But the high priest saw it in a completely different way. He thought that it was proof that Eliza was guilty, and that she was shaking her head because she hated her crime. Then 2 large tears rolled down the king's cheeks. For the first time in his life, the king returned to his castle with a suspicious heart. He could not find peace and sleep. He found Eliza quietly getting up, and every night after that he did the same thing. Each time, she followed Eliza quietly and saw her disappear into the cave. The king's face grew darker and darker with each passing day. When Eliza found him, she did not know why, but she was very worried. She was also troubled by her siblings. Eliza's hot tears ran down the queen's velvet and purple dress, and they shone like diamonds. Everyone who saw her beautiful appearance envied her and wanted to be the queen. In the meantime, Eliza's work was gradually completed. All that remained was one piece of chain mail that was half finished. Not a single nettle was left. So she had to go back to the temple cemetery one more time to pull out just a handful of grass. Even Eliza was hesitant at the thought of going alone in the darkness and meeting the terrible monster. But her resolve was as strong as her faith in God. So she set off. The king and the high priest followed her. They saw her slip through the gates and disappear into the cemetery. When they came closer, they saw the blood-sucking monsters on the tombstones just as Eliza had seen them. The king was shocked to see that Eliza was among them. He remembered that the queen had been in his heart until that evening. "I will leave the judgment to the people," said the king. So the people sentenced Eliza to be burned at the stake. She was driven from the splendid, magnificent halls of the palace into a dark, damp cellar. The wind blew in through the iron-barred windows. Instead of the velvet and silk that she had been wearing, bunches of nettles that Eliza had gathered were thrown in, and she was allowed to rest her head on them. The chain mail that Eliza had woven, burning with stiff thorns, became her feather duvet and nightgown. But no gift could have pleased Eliza more. Eliza continued her work and prayed again. Outside, the town's wicked boys were singing naughty songs. Not a single one of them could say a kind word to her. But in the evening, they heard the flapping of a swan's wings near the iron bars. It was the youngest brother. He had found his little sister. She cried out in joy and sobbed. But in her heart, she thought that night would soon fall, and the world would be over. But the work was about to be finished. And the brothers were already there. The high priest had promised the king that he would stay with Eliza until the end. So when he came up to her and told her, she shook her head, and with her eyes and gestures begged him to leave. She would finish her work tonight. Otherwise, all her tears, her suffering, and her sleepless nights would have been for nothing. The bishop left behind a nasty, cursed word as he left. But Eliza knew she had done nothing wrong. So she went on with her work. A little mouse ran around on the floor and pulled some nettles up to her feet. It was meant to help her. Then the thrush sat on the window sill and sang its lovely song all night long, encouraging them not to lose heart. Outside, it was still faintly lighted before dawn. The sun would not rise for another hour. Then the 11 siblings came to the castle gate and asked the king to see them. But they were told that this was not possible, as the night was still early. The king was asleep and they should not disturb him. She said she couldn't do it. But her siblings continued to beg and threaten her. Then the soldiers came out. Eventually, even the king came out and asked what was going on. Then the siblings were gone. But 11 wild swans flew over the castle. All the people gathered at the town gate, and crowded together to see the witch burned alive. A weak, skinny horse came, pulling the carriage carrying the criminals. Soon Eliza was dressed in a simple linen robe. Her beautiful hair hung in a mess around her pretty neck. Her cheeks were as pale as death. Her lips were moving slightly. But her fingers continued to work busily at weaving the green linen. Even on the way to her death row, she did not stop what she had started. The 10 chain mail pieces were under her feet. She was now making the 11th. The people gathered round and mocked her. "Look, the witch is muttering something. She has no hymns with her. Why is she still practicing her nasty magic? Let's tear her to shreds." And they all came round and tried to tear the chain mail apart. At that moment, 11 wild swans swooped down. They landed on the carriage, encircled Eliza, and flapped their wings. The crowd was shocked and drew back. "It is God's will. Surely the woman is innocent," many whispered. But no one could say it louder or more clearly. Just then, an official came and held Eliza's hand. So Eliza hurriedly threw the 11 chain mail pieces on the swans. Immediately, 11 noble princes stood there. The youngest, however, was missing a hand, and instead had a swan feather on. This was because one sleeve of his chain mail was missing. They all were unable to finish in one breath. "Now, I can speak," said Eliza. "I am innocent." The people, having seen what had just happened, all bowed their heads respectfully, as they would before a great lord. But Eliza collapsed into her brother's arms as if dead. All the tension and suffering she had felt up until that point came to her in one fell swoop. Yes, Elisa's innocent, said the eldest brother. He then told them everything that had happened. As he spoke, a fragrance like that of millions of rose petals wafting forth from the air. The firewood piled up in front of the execution post sprouted roots, branches, and flowers blossomed. There, a hedge full of red roses grew tall and wide, and at the very top of it all was a single white flower that shone like a star. The king picked the flower and placed it on Eliza's chest. She suddenly woke up, and her heart was filled with peace and happiness. At that moment, all the temple bells began to ring by themselves. A large group of small birds flew in. Then a great celebratory procession, the like of which no king had ever seen, came to the castle. That's that.